Greetings and good evening, beautiful people. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Hope you're having a fantastic day and week. Welcome to our live weekly readings on YouTube of the final report of the California Reparations Task Force right here on the CJEC YouTube channel. This is the only live reading of the California Reparations Task Force's final report on YouTube. The final report of the first in the nation Reparations Task Force is one of, if not the most important government reports about the Black American community since the 1960s. Equally important, it's also the foundation for current and future reparations legislation. The report is nearly 1,100 pages long, and we're bringing every page of it to you, chapter by chapter, every week on Thursdays at 7 p.m. PST, that's Pacific Standard Time, so that you are properly educated in your advocacy for reparations in California. Today's reading of the final report is presented to you as a community service with support from the reparations organizing and mobilizing team at the Coalition for a Just and Equitable California, or CJEC. CJEC is California's leading grassroots organization born for reparations and reparative justice for Black American freedmen living in California. For more info on CJEC and our work helping to enact the law that created the California Reparations Task Force, California's law requiring state agencies to collect data on descendants of U.S. slavery, the Act to End Current Slavery in California state prisons, the California Freedmen Affairs Bill, and more, visit www.cjec-official.org. Before we go any further, right now, I need you to do three things. First, connect to our YouTube channel by liking this video, hitting the bell for reminders, and subscribing to our YouTube channel. Second, get connected. To do that, follow CJEC on all social media platforms. That's Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and Twitter at CJEC Official. Finally, get informed and involved. And to do that, visit www.cjec-official.org to sign up for current and accurate California reparations news and info on our Get Involved page, and support our work by volunteering and or donating. To donate, just click the Donate tab on the homepage of our website. A special thanks to our amazing fiscal sponsor, the California Black Women's Health Project. You can learn more about our fiscal sponsor, the California Black Women's Health Project, at www.cabwhp.org. By way of introduction, my name is Chris Lodgson. I live in Sacramento. I'm from New York City, and I'm a volunteer reparations advocate with CJEC's reparations organizing and mobilizing team. The agenda for today, Chapter 18 of the final report of the California Reparations Task Force. The title of the chapter we're reading tonight, Introduction to the Task Force's Final Recommendations. You can follow along in the reading, download tonight's chapter or the full final report yourself by going to our website, www.cjec-official.org/reports. Okay, we're about ready to start reading, but before we do, I have some special thanks and some special announcements to make. First, as always, I'd like to thank our good friends at ETM Media Group on YouTube for their live readings of the first California Reparations Report. You can watch their readings of the first report on their channel at ETM Media Group on YouTube and on our website, of course, at www.cjec-official.org/videos. Second, for those of you who don't know, historic reparations legislation in California is here, and more is coming. Senate Bill 490 is California's first lineage-based reparations-related legislation to establish the California American Freedmen Affairs Agency. The bill was introduced by State Senator Stephen Bradford and will move forward in 2024. To read the bill, visit www.cjec-official.org/advocacy. Third, as mentioned, more historic reparations bills are coming. Over the next several months, more reparations bills will be written. And during the 2024 legislative session, we'll see those bills introduced and start moving toward passage by majorities of both the California State Assembly and Senate. To pass reparations bills in 2024, we need 41 assembly members and 21 senators to say yes. When those bills are passed, we need our governor to sign the bills. So, to make reparations a reality in California, the math is 41 plus 21 plus 1. That's 41 assembly members, 21 senators, and 1 governor. 41 plus 21 plus 1 equals reparations in California. Lastly, but not least, special thanks to CJEC's reparations organizing and mobilizing team, and specifically our volunteer final report readers. And without further ado, Chapter 18 of the final report of the California Reparations Task Force. Chapter 18, Introduction to the Task Force's final recommendations. Quote, if you stick a knife in my back 9 inches and pull it out 6 inches, there's no progress. If you pull it all the way out, that's not progress. The progress is healing the wound that the blow made. End quote. Malcolm X. The chapters comprising this part of the report set forth policy recommendations that are tailored to the harms discussed in chapters 1 through 13. The task force's intent in formulating these recommendations has been to ensure, quote, special consideration for African Americans who are descendants of persons enslaved in the United States, end quote. In the task force's view, adoption and implementation of these recommendations are crucial to effectuating AB 3121's purpose and beginning the long overdue process of providing true reparations for African Americans. As the legislature recognized in AB 3121, and as chapters 1 through 13 of this report document, while the enslavement of Africans was our nation's, quote, original sin, end quote, emancipation did not bring an end to the atrocities and deprivations visited upon African Americans. Through lynching and other terror, including the Black Codes, Jim Crow laws, discrimination, segregation, exclusion, and neglect in every facet of life, government at all levels has perpetuated the legacy of slavery. African Americans as a group, and especially descendants of those enslaved, live with the persistent consequences of this legacy. These consequences include, among numerous other devastating impacts, a shorter life expectancy due to inadequate and biased healthcare, environmental harms, and a whole range of other factors addressed in this report, as well as a vast wealth gap born of stolen labor, political disenfranchisement, limited education and employment opportunities, property deprivation, the decimation of cultural institutions, mass incarceration, and a host of policies that pathologized and undermined African American families. Mass enslavement may have ended, but the badges and incidents of slavery have not. Descendants of those who were enslaved have carried the weight of the harms and atrocities visited upon their ancestors, as trauma and loss have passed from generation to generation. The harms African Americans have experienced have not been incidental or accidental. They have been by design. They are the result of discriminatory laws, regulations, and policies enacted and implemented by government. These laws and policies have enabled government officials and private individuals and entities to perpetuate the legacy of slavery by subjugating African Americans to discrimination, exclusion, neglect, and violence in every facet of American life. And there has been no countervailing comprehensive effort to disrupt and dismantle institutionalized racism, stop the harm, and address the specific injuries caused to descendants and the larger African American community. AB 3121 calls for this to change. AB 3121 invokes the international standards of remedy for wrongs and injuries caused by the state. The UN principles on reparation recognize that true reparations cannot be made without fulfillment of all 5 of the international standards required pillars. 1, restitution. 2, compensation. 3, rehabilitation. 4, satisfaction. And 5, guarantees of non-repetition. In developing its policy recommendations, presented in this chapter and the chapters that follow, The task force follows the UN principles on reparation. Specifically, the task force recommends to the legislature a slate of policies that are needed both to cease and to redress the harms delineated in chapters 1 through 13. These recommended changes or substantially similar measures must be implemented in some form in order for any California reparatory effort to be able to satisfy the international reparations framework's requirements that there be both, quote, rehabilitation, end quote, and, quote, guarantees of non-repetition, end quote. Further, a number of the policies recommended in the following chapters are also intended to provide restitution to augment the task force's recommendations for restitution and compensation set forth in Chapter 17 of this report. In making its recommendations, consonant with the statute and in recognition that the legacy of slavery weighs most heavily on those directly harmed, the task force has given special consideration to African Americans who are descendants of persons enslaved in the United States. However, also in line with the language of AB 3121 and the extensive testimony and other evidence submitted, the task force considered the impact of historic and ongoing discrimination on the larger African American community, on the community of large, on the larger community of African Americans living in California. The UN principles on reparations similarly take an expansive view of what it means to be a, quote, victim, end quote. The term includes, quote, persons who individually or collectively suffered harm, including physical or mental injury, emotional suffering, economic loss, or substantial impairment of their fundamental rights through acts or omissions that constitute gross violations of international human rights law or serious violations of international humanitarian law, end quote. The term has been interpreted to include, quote, not only the person who was the direct target of the violation, but any person affected by it indirectly or directly, end quote. As this report has documented, little of slavery's legacy has receded. To be African American in America today is to be part of a collective that bears the badges and incidents of slavery and suffers the, quote, lingering material and psychosocial effects of slavery, end quote, and the injuries that their perpetuation caused. While recommending that monetary reparations be limited to the eligible class, as discussed in Chapter 17, the task force recognizes that the 5 pillars of reparations and AB 3121 require that it also endeavor to ensure cumulative harms of the past 4 centuries do not continue to be visited upon, quote, living African Americans and on society in California and the United States, end quote. The task force therefore grappled with the appropriate scope of its policy recommendations, considering AB 3121's mandate, the international standards for reparations, practical aspects of implementation, and the anticipated impact of recommended policies. Following testimony and public comment in hearings held over the span of 2 years, extensive original research, analysis, and deliberation, the task force believes it has struck the appropriate balance. Every one of the task force's recommendations is intended to benefit descendants, and a substantial number are intended to benefit descendants exclusively. The task force has determined, in its judgment, that the scope of each recommendation matches what is needed to bring repair to all those who have endured the harms outlined in this report, and to ensure that guarantees of non-repetition for those harms are fully realized. The enormity of the task force, of the task before California and the nation cannot be overstated. The policies recommended here, while wide-ranging, are not exhaustive. They are only a start. The harms to be repaired have been more than 400 years in the making. Is ahead. Their undoing will also require what the legislature courageously did not mask in enacting AB 3121. The explicit consideration of race in redressing the harms perpetuated against generations of African Americans in California and the nation. As one expert before the task force in California testified, California has become a, quote, don't say black, quote, state because of Proposition 209. While the task force recommends, which the task force recommends be repealed. The system of oppression that centers on race and which has dehumanized and brutalized on the basis of race thrives when the basic fact underlying the system is denied. Similarly, a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist and task force expert witness, Isabel Wilkerson, has written, quote, "In America, race is the primary tool and the visible decoy for caste," end quote. The perpetuation of, quote, colorblind, end quote, thinking, rather than advancing social justice, has allowed injustice to fester and entrench. The policy recommendations set forth in this chapter are not limited to one set of harms or another. The task force has formulated these policies to address reparatory needs that cut across the areas of harm documented in chapters 1 through 13 of this report. A first order need, and thus the task force's first recommendation, is a fully funded, independent agency dedicated to advancing all of the recommendations contained in this report. Additional recommendations set forth in this chapter are intended to advance reparations more broadly by removing critical structural barriers to change and ensuring that future legislative and agency action does not repeat the mistakes of the past. These general structural recommendations would, if implemented, create an environment in which the collective recommendations of this report could set California on a path to acknowledging and repairing the causes and consequences of human rights violations and inequality resulting from the incidents of slavery and human rights violations perpetuated by the legacy of slavery. These proposals, detailed below, are to create and fund the California American Freedmen Affairs Agency, repeal Prop 209, mandate effective racial impact analysis, require agency transparency, make legislative findings that build legislative records that reflect the historic and present state of pervasive structural barriers and discrimination against African Americans of the United States. Create and fund the California American Freedmen Affairs Agency. As documented in chapters 1 through 13, government agencies at all levels, including California state agencies, have been complicit in the atrocities committed against African Americans in California and across the country. And throughout the history of the state and the nation, government programs designed to benefit the general public, either intentionally or incidentally, excluded or minimized the benefit to African Americans. When African Americans are not an exclusive focus of and receive disproportionately fewer benefits than others. To ensure that this time is different and that there will be a focus on efforts flowing from this report, the task force recommends that the legislature create an agency that is dedicated to the implementation and success of the recommendations of this report. Complex new functions will be needed to implement the task force's recommended reparations proposals and administer the monetary components of the task force's recommendations, including determinations of eligibility and disbursements of payments. In addition, as discussed below, the task force recommends that the legislature provide the agency with an oversight role to ensure that existing state agencies properly implement the legislative enactments resulting from the task force's recommendation, where those recommendations fall within the scope of those existing agencies' authority. Finally, there will be some instances where the new agency will have to provide direct services to fill in gaps or augment existing services to ensure that the needs of those eligible for its services are fully met, without bias and without delay. For these reasons, the task force recommends the creation of the California American Freedmen Affairs Agency, the mission of which will be to support the implementation of the statutes approved by the legislature and the governor in response to this report. The task force also believes that it is essential for the agency to be fully funded and staffed to carry out its mission and obligations. And these resources should be allocated and authorized in perpetuity. The task force recommends that the agency be headquartered in Sacramento and have satellite offices around the state to ensure that descendants and other applicants are able to obtain services and support close to where they reside. The California American Freedmen Affairs Agency shall include the following to ensure the performance of critical functions and services. 1. A genealogy office to support potential reparations claimants by providing access to expert genealogical research and confirm reparations eligibility and expedited assistance with the reparations claims process. 2. An Office of Strategic Communications and Media Affairs to provide streamlined access to information and services to assist the descendant community, the media, and the general public in understanding the work performed by the agency. 3. A community support office to improve accessibility, transparency, and public trust in California's reparations program and its claims process. 4. A business affairs office to A. Provide support in the establishment of a Freedmen's Savings and Trust Bank. B. Support for entrepreneurialism and a foundation for financial literacy. C. Provide business grants and assistance in obtaining business licenses. D. Employment training and apprenticeship programs to train unhoused descendants for employment in housing construction and related trades. And E. Establish public-private reparative justice-oriented partnerships. See Chapter 17, Policies Addressing Stolen Labor and Hindered Opportunity, for the text of the task force's recommendation to fund African American banks. 5. An Office of the Chief Financial Officer to provide policy leadership in strategic planning, budgeting, and financial management. The officer's duties shall include A. Processing claims for direct compensation in the 5 atrocity areas. B. Conducting internal audits for management purposes to evaluate the efficiency, economy, effectiveness, financial aspects, or other features of the agency, its branches, and programs. C. Administration, including auditing of contracts and grants. D. Assisting in the establishment of a state-sponsored or state-chartered Freedmen's Savings and Trust Bank to service the descendant community. And E. Potentially collaborating with 501c4 organizations where beneficial to the goals and purpose of the agency. This office would administer the compensation funds that the task force recommends be created by the legislature for all those eligible to receive compensation. 6. A creative, cultural, and intellectual affairs office to address the disruption of cultural centers in the name of redevelopment and to address the history of censorship of descendant-produced media and arts. The duties of this branch should include A. Building, restoring, and maintaining African American or American freedmen descendant cultural historical sites, creative cultural centers, public displays, and monuments. B. Advocating for and monitoring the removal of harmful relics. C. Supporting knowledge production and archival research with community archives and repositories. D. Supporting legacy families. E. Providing support for descendants in the arts, entertainment, and sports industries, including identifying and removing barriers to the advancement into leadership and decision-making positions in these industries. F. Supporting descendants in news publications, arts, including film, radio, television, podcasting, and new media, and lifestyle activities. And G. Supporting parity in sports participation, coaching, management, and ownership. 7. A data and research collection office to identify and analyze trends in past, current, and potential future badges and incidents of slavery, and to advise the governor, legislature, and other state and local government entities as to policy changes designed to heal and repair the descendant community from these badges and incidents. 8. A civic engagement or self-determination office to support ongoing education on African American history and political engagement, and to support civic engagement, political participation, and self-determination among the descendant community. 9. An Office of General Counsel to provide legal advice, counsel, and services to the agency and its officials, and to ensure that the agency's programs are administered in accordance with the applicable legislative authority. The office would also advise the head of the agency on legislative, legal, and regulatory initiatives and serve as an external liaison on legal matters with other state agencies and entities. The agency would be authorized to engage in oversight and monitoring of state agencies tasked with engaging in direct implementation of recommendations already falling within the scope of their existing authority. The oversight and monitoring should include at least the following. 1, an education office to provide oversight and monitoring of the payment of tuition to the state's colleges and universities for California residents who are descendants, and to ensure that existing state educational agencies eliminate barriers to higher education for descendants. The Education Office shall also encourage, oversee, and monitor the building of infrastructure for the operation of new freedmen schools, colleges, and universities. The Education Office would also provide oversight and monitoring of educational grants and support education initiatives focused on descendants. 2, a Social Services and Family Affairs Office to provide oversight of state agencies' efforts to identify and mitigate the ways that current and previous policies implemented by existing agencies have damaged and destabilized descendant families. The office's oversight would include a monitoring of state agencies' recruitment and training of descendants in industries that assist descendant seniors, such as healthcare systems. B, providing housing advocates and housing attorneys to assist with housing and houselessness. C, providing financial and social support services for housing unhoused relatives. D, developing a hotline to report harms related to housing. E, providing financial support services to support descendant homeownership. F, ensuring treatment for trauma and family healing services to strengthen the family unity. And G, providing descendant-informed mental health and stress resiliency services, financial planning services, career planning, and civil and family court services. 3, a medical services office to provide oversight to monitor the state's effort to provide technical assistance for community wellness centers in local descendant communities across the state to A, decrease state-sanctioned health harms, including but not limited to physical and public health harms and neglect. B, mental health stigma. C, teach stress reduction and resiliency tools. D, create communal spaces. E, support cultural and racial socialization to support mental health. F, provide community-defined evidence and promising practices prevention and early intervention mental health programs. And G, offer mental and physical health screening and referrals. 4, a labor and employment office to oversee and monitor labor and employment discrimination and benefits claims involving the descendant community, handled by other state-level complaint investigation and adjudication agencies. 5, a development office to provide oversight and monitoring of state-sponsored and state-funded infrastructure development to ensure that descendants receive a proportionate share of the development of housing, for example, subdivisions, multifamily and mixed use, business and commercial districts, and towns and cities. In addition to Allensworth, African-American towns such as Teviston, Farmead, Cooksville, Bowles Color Colony, South Dos Palos, and Sunny Acres all existed in California's Central Valley and should receive the same investment from the state. 6, a legal affairs office to provide A, oversight and monitoring of state agencies that provide legal services to descendants, including in criminal cases, and oversight, and monitoring of state agencies and entities that receive, document, and investigate civil rights violations and hate crimes, and ensure that such entities provide a hotline and database for the descendant community. B, advocate for civil and criminal justice reforms, including but not limited to youth and adult decarceration programs, abolition, and housing and houselessness legal services. And C, monitor provisions of civil legal services, including free arbitration and mediation services, and other forms of conciliation courts to the extent needed to close the justice gap. 7, a strategic partnerships office to oversee and monitor the state's collaboration with community-based organizations and other relevant organizations, and to oversee and audit state funds dispersed to identified CBOs and other relevant stakeholders to ensure that said funding is directed toward eligible individuals or entities. Repeal Proposition 209. California voters passed Proposition 209, now enshrined in California's Constitution in 1996. The measure bars the state from, quote, discriminating against or granting preferential treatment to any individual or group on the basis of race, sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin in the operation of public employment, public education, and public contracting, end quote. Since its passage, Proposition 209 has had far-reaching impacts on efforts to remediate entrenched systemic anti-Black bias and discrimination. The area of public contracting provides one example. The Equal Justice Society commissioned a study to determine the impact of Proposition 209 in the sphere of public contracting. The study concluded that between $1 billion and $1.1 billion in contract dollars were lost annually by businesses owned by women and people of color due to Proposition 209. With respect to education and the end of race-conscious admissions at the University of California, admissions declined for applicants from underrepresented groups, including African Americans, at every campus. Also, civil service employment of African Americans dropped sharply. More broadly, Proposition 209 is widely viewed as an impediment to the adoption of remedial measures, and this chilling effect has been far-reaching. In November 2020, Proposition 16 appeared on the general election ballot, asking California voters to amend the California Constitution to repeal Proposition 209. However, Proposition 16 failed to achieve enough support to pass, and Proposition 209 remains in effect. In recognition of the systemic discrimination faced by the African American community and the barriers to justice and repair imposed by Proposition 209, the task force recommends that the legislature take steps within its authority to seek the repeal of Proposition 209. This effort must continue until California's Constitution has been cleansed of this or any other measure rooted in racism. Mandate effective racial impact analyses. For too long, the country and state have taken a, quote, head in the sand, end quote, approach to the pernicious impact of racism on all types of decision-making. Outside of the limited context, courts in particular have prevented a more nuanced look at the impact of racism, instead requiring proof of intent to discriminate when presented with evidence of discriminatory impact. The result, as documented throughout this report, is persistent, ever more entrenched racial disparities that result in African Americans experiencing the worst outcomes while paradoxically being denied justice by the courts. To address this, the task force recommends that the legislature require that the racial impact of laws, policies, and ordinances from the local to the state level be identified and addressed prior to enactment, and that implementation be carefully monitored and measured in order to assess real-world results. Where those results demonstrate negative racial impact has resulted, the law, policy, or ordinance should be required to be repealed and, where possible, re-promulgated in a manner that avoids the adverse racial impact. The task force's recommendations build on the recognition that racism is a public health emergency with major harm to African Americans in California. Recognizing the pernicious impact of racism in this manner is intended to, quote, spur changes across all sectors of government, including criminal justice, education, healthcare, housing, transportation, budgets and taxes, economic development, and social services, end quote. Numerous municipalities, and states have taken the step of formally recognizing racism as a public health emergency. At the state level in California, Senate Concurrent Resolution number 17 from 2021 declared California's observance of March 21st, 2021 as the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. In the resolution, quote, the legislature declared racism a public health crisis and committed to, quote, to actively participate in the dismantling of racism, end quote. In 2020, Senator Richard Pan, a doctor, introduced Senate Bill number 17, which would have created a racial equity commission, but the bill did not pass. To ensure that future laws and policies do not perpetuate the state's history of discrimination against African Americans, and to ensure that there is a long-term and ongoing commitment to remedying and avoiding the harms caused by the history and trauma of state-sponsored discrimination against African Americans across all sectors. The task force recommends that the legislature require comprehensive racial impact analyses of legislative and executive actions at the state and local levels. Racial impact analyses are tools for lawmakers to evaluate potential disparate impacts of proposed legislation prior to adoption and implementation. Similar to fiscal or environmental impact statements, a racial impact analysis enables policy decision makers to anticipate and address racial or ethnic disparities arising from implicit bias and systemic racism and discrimination. Requiring such an analysis also assists in the consideration of alternative policies to accomplish the goals of the proposed legislation without causing or contributing to avoidable racial and ethnic disparities. This recommendation for a requirement of racial impact analyses encompasses all proposed legislation, budget proposals, proposed regulations, and contracts subject to bidding, and is intended to include, but not be limited to, governmental agencies at all levels, including cities, counties, school districts, and boards, including charter schools, special districts, and each state or local agency, board, or commission. The task force urges that, in furtherance of this effort, the legislature takes steps within its authority to require a racial impact analysis for all future legislation, including potential amendments to the California Constitution. The task force recommends the legislature create a process and provide funding for the appropriate agency or office to conduct racial impact analyses of all bills while they are in committee. The task force also recommends that the legislature require the analysis to be submitted in writing and include specific findings of the impact proposed legislation will likely have on African Americans. Similar assessments should also be made by any state agency involved in the rulemaking process. Also, the task force recommends that the racial impact analysis continue after enactment of legislation, with the requirement that data be gathered to empirically establish the racial impact of implemented policies. The task force recommends that the legislature establish a process for amending a policy, law, or regulation if data verifies a disparate impact on African Americans. California has a history of enacting laws that, even if not affirmatively discriminatory on their face, have had the impact of fostering, permitting, or exacerbating discrimination against African Americans. Many have been used in a discriminatory manner. For example, zoning codes, licensing laws, fire and safety codes, and anti-nuisance provisions have been used to discriminate against African American business owners and their African American customers. With this proposal, the task force seeks to ensure that disproportionate negative impact on African Americans is addressed during the legislative process rather than hoping for repair through the judicial process, which, as discussed throughout this report, has historically been skewed against African Americans. The task force further recommends that the legislature enact legislation requiring the governor to conduct racial impact analyses for California's annual budget and any proposed agency regulations. The legislation should require the governor to submit a written report of the analysis to the legislature, along with the budget proposal and proposed regulations. The task force also recommends that the legislature enact legislation requiring general contractors who participate in the state government requests for proposals process, or RFPs, to include disparate impact analysis in their bids, especially those related to public safety and housing. Require agency transparency. Members of the public, in their public comments and other communications with the task force, have repeatedly raised concerns about responsiveness and transparency related to the treatment and disposition of complaints from African Americans raising civil rights concerns. Responding to the concerns raised, the task force recommends that the legislature direct the Civil Rights Department and Department of Education to collect anonymized data for all complaints transmitted to each respective agency, including the following: 1, race, gender, age, and other critical demographic information of complaints. 2, a description of each complaint received. 3, any action taken by the agency in response to the complaint received and the timeline for such action. 4, the disposition of the complaints. The task force further recommends that this data be published on the agency's websites and be transmitted to the California American Freedmen Affairs Agency for the agency to create and publish dashboards that allow the public to view the collected data. The task force urges the Civil Rights Department and the Department of Education, as well as any other state agencies similarly situated, to recommit their focus to reviewing and efficiently and effectively redressing the concerns of African Americans filing complaints with them as required by law. Make legislative findings that build legislative records that reflect the historic and present state of pervasive structural barriers and discrimination against African Americans and support reparative enactments. When enacting the task force's recommendations, the legislature should, 1, declare the state's compelling and statewide interest in remedying the longstanding and ongoing harm caused by chattel slavery and the badges and incidents of slavery, as documented by the task force's report and any other supplemental findings the legislature finds necessary. 2, where applicable, identify the specific harms caused by chattel slavery and its legacy that the statute seeks to remedy, and explain how the government was involved in such discrimination. And 3, for those provisions that may be subject to strict scrutiny, demonstrate that the policies enacted have been narrowly tailored to remedy that harm. Transmit the AB 3121 Task Force report to the President of the United States and the United States Congress. The task force recommends that the legislature transmit the task force's final report and its findings to the President and Congress, with a recommendation that the federal government create a reparations commission for African Americans through statute or executive action. Further, the task force recommends that the legislature urge the federal government to match the breadth and comprehensiveness of the task force's final report and its findings, or accept the task force's findings without the need for further study, and commit to full and effective reparations under international law, in line with the task force's recommendations. And that will conclude tonight's reading of Chapter 18 of the final report of the California Reparations Task Force. Before you go, if you haven't done so already, don't forget to like this video, hit the bell for reminders, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. When you go, don't forget to get connected. Follow CJEC on all social media. That's Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and Twitter at CJEC Official. Get informed. Visit www.cjec-official.org and sign up for current and accurate California reparations news and info on our Get Involved page. Get involved. Support our work by volunteering and or donating. To donate, just click the donate tab on the homepage of our website. A special thanks to our amazing fiscal sponsors, once again, the California Black Women's Health Project. Thank you all so much for your time. I appreciate you all. We are closer to reparations than we've ever been in California. Have a great night.